She left her wedding ring on the table. Not thrown, not dropped in anger, placed, deliberately, like punctuation at the end of a sentence she'd been writing for months. Vincent Moretti found it at 11:47 p.m., still wearing his coat, rain dripping from his shoulders onto the marble floor of the dining room he'd built for her. The anniversary candles had burned themselves down to waxy stumps. The roasted lamb she'd spent 3 hours preparing sat cold and untouched beneath a silver cover. And there, resting against the base of the candlestick, was her ring, the one he'd slid onto her finger exactly 1 year ago today, while his hand shook for the first and only time in his adult life. Next to it, a folded note. 5 words. This time, choose the right woman. If someone you loved walked out tonight, not in anger, not in tears, but in silence, after planning it for months, would you even know why? Would you deserve to? This is the story of the night Vincent Moretti, the most feared man in Chicago, finally met the one enemy he couldn't threaten, bribe, or outrun, the consequences of his own choices. Stay with us until the end. If this story reaches you, if something in it lands somewhere real, hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to know how far this story travels. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next, because what Vincent discovers over the next 5 days will change everything he thought he knew about loyalty, love, and the price of getting it wrong. Now, let's go back to where it started. The call came at 8:14 p.m. Vincent was in the kitchen doorway, jacket already off, watching Charlotte move around the stove with the quiet confidence of someone who had decided, a long time ago, not to need much. She wasn't performing domesticity. She genuinely liked to cook. That was one of the first things that had surprised him about her. Charlotte Hayes, daughter of a federal judge, Columbia law graduate, didn't pretend cooking was beneath her. She just did it, efficiently, without ceremony. She had her hair pinned up loosely, a few dark strands escaping near her neck. She was wearing the cream-colored dress she'd bought specifically for tonight. She didn't know he'd noticed that. He'd noticed. The dining table behind her was set for 2. Real candles, not electric. Crystal glasses. The good china, the set her mother had given them, which Charlotte never used for anything casual because she believed certain things should be saved for occasions that deserved them. Their first anniversary was, apparently, an occasion that deserved them. Vincent stood there for a moment longer than he needed to. He had been doing that lately, pausing in doorways, watching her, storing the image somewhere he couldn't quite name. The therapist Marco had suggested he see, years ago, would probably have something to say about that. Vincent had never gone. Then his phone vibrated. He almost didn't look. He had told Dom, his head of security, that tonight was off limits unless someone was dying. He pulled the phone from his pocket with the intention of sending it straight to voicemail. The name on the screen stopped him. Olivia. He hadn't spoken to Olivia Sterling in 14 months. He hadn't needed to. Their ending had been clean by the standards of his world. No threats, no money changing hands, just a conversation in the parking garage of his office building where she cried and he stood there unable to give her what she was asking for, which was a future. He'd felt like something hollow afterward. Not guilty, exactly. Just empty in a way that took weeks to fill back in. Charlotte didn't know about the parking garage conversation. She didn't need to. He looked at the screen, looked at Charlotte's back, looked at the screen again. He stepped into the hallway and answered, "Olivia." "Vincent." Her voice was wrong immediately. Too high, too fast. The kind of breathing that comes when someone is trying to stay quiet while also trying not to fall apart. "I need you to listen to me. I know I don't have the right to call you. I know that. But there's nowhere else. Vincent, there are men outside my apartment. I don't know who they are. I called the police and they said they'd send someone, but nobody came, and I can hear them in the hallway, and I don't—" "Slow down." His voice dropped automatically into the register he used for emergencies. Flat, controlled. He was already moving toward the front closet where he kept his coat. "How many?" "I don't know. 2, maybe 3. I saw them through the peephole. They have—" a sharp intake of breath. "I think one of them has a gun." Every instinct he'd developed over 20 years of running the Moretti Syndicate told him this could be a setup. He knew that. He was not a naive man, but Olivia's fear sounded real. And Vincent Moretti had a rule, one he hadn't broken in 15 years, one his father had given him not as advice but as a condition of inheriting the family name. You do not ignore someone begging for help. Not a stranger. Not an enemy. Certainly not someone who once meant something to you. His father had broken that rule once. Vincent had watched a man bleed out in the back of a car as a result. He'd been 16. He still dreamed about it occasionally. "Lock yourself in the bathroom," he said, pulling his coat off the hanger. "Don't open the door for anyone, I'm coming." He walked back to the kitchen doorway. Charlotte had her back to him still. She was plating something, moving with that same unhurried precision, the kind that made you feel like the world was steadier than it actually was. "I have to go out," he said. She didn't turn around right away. When she did, her expression was already arranged, composed, the kind of composure that takes practice, that you learn when you've had enough disappointments to understand that falling apart in front of someone doesn't actually change the outcome. "Tonight," she said. "Not a question. It's an emergency. Someone could get hurt." She looked at him for a moment. He watched her eyes go to the table, the candles, the china, the glasses, and come back to him. Something moved through her face that he couldn't name, and then it was gone. "Okay," she said. That was it. "Okay." No argument, no ultimatum. She turned back to the stove and adjusted the flame under something that no longer needed adjusting. "I'll be back as soon as I can," he said. She didn't answer. He left. The drive to Olivia's apartment on the north side took 22 minutes through the rain. Vincent had Dom and two others in a trailing car. He arrived to find the building quiet. Doorman at the desk, looking bored. Elevator working normally. Third floor hallway empty. No sign of forced entry. No men with guns. No indication that anything had happened or was about to. Olivia answered her door in a bathrobe, mascara smeared, a glass of red wine in her hand. She wasn't hiding in the bathroom. She was on her couch, a half-empty bottle on the coffee table, her laptop open to something she quickly closed. The fear in her voice had been real. He was almost certain of that. But the situation on the ground was nothing. Shadows. A noise in the hallway that could have been anything, possibly the wine. He stood in her living room for 8 minutes, long enough to confirm the apartment was clear, long enough to hear her apologize 3 times in a way that felt genuine, but also slightly theatrical. He told her to call building security if she heard anything else. He told her not to call him again. He drove home. The front door of the lakeside mansion was unlocked. That was the first wrong thing. Charlotte always locked it before 10, even when he was expected back. A habit from a childhood in a house where the locks were the last line against a father who couldn't always control himself after his third drink. The foyer was dark except for the light spilling in from the dining room. Vincent walked through it and stopped. The table was exactly as she'd set it, plates untouched, food cold, candles burned down to almost nothing, small orange flames wavering above waxy puddles. The crystal glasses still empty. Charlotte's chair was pushed in neatly. Her coat was gone from the hook by the back door. Her keys were gone from the dish on the counter where she always left them. Her reading glasses, the ones she left everywhere, on every surface in the house, the ones he sometimes found on the bathroom windowsill and the kitchen table and once on top of the refrigerator for reasons neither of them could explain, were not on the counter or the table or the windowsill or anywhere. Her reading glasses were gone. That detail hit him harder than the empty table. She'd planned this. She hadn't walked out in a moment of hurt. She had packed what she needed, including things small enough to overlook, and she had left with intention. He saw the ring then. He almost missed it because it was resting against the base of the candlestick rather than out in the open, as though she'd placed it somewhere he'd have to look for it. Not hidden, but not obvious either. Like she'd wanted him to find it only after he'd already noticed everything else. He picked it up, turned it over. The engraving inside, V+C, always forward. He set it down. Then he unfolded the note. This time, choose the right woman. His first reaction was not grief. He would feel that later in waves at unpredictable moments. His first reaction was a kind of cold, slow-burning recognition, the feeling of understanding something you'd been refusing to see for a long time. He called her phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Her voice on the recording sounded like her, calm and slightly businesslike, the way she answered most things. He hung up without leaving a message. He called again, voicemail. He texted, "Charlotte, call me." He put the phone down on the table beside the ring. Then he sat down in his chair, the one at the head of the table, the position of authority he occupied out of habit, and he stayed very still for a long time. Dom called at 20 after midnight. Vincent answered on the first ring. "She's not at her sister's," Dom said without preamble. I was good at reading the room even over the phone. Her sister says she hasn't heard from her in 3 days. I've got 2 guys on her parents' place in Winnetka. Nothing. I ran the credit cards. Last charge was this afternoon. Pharmacy on Michigan Avenue, 2:17 p.m. Hotels. Already on it. She's not registered anywhere under her name. She's smart enough to use cash, Vincent said. A pause. Yeah, Dom said. I know. Keep looking. He hung up. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the dining room until the candles went out on their own, and then he sat in the dark, and he did not allow himself to move until he had forced himself through the full sequence of the evening from the beginning. The phone call, Olivia's voice, the decision to leave, Charlotte's face in the moment before she said, okay, the 8 minutes in Olivia's apartment, the drive home, the unlocked door. He ran it again, and again. On the fourth pass, he noticed something he'd missed. When he'd stood in the kitchen doorway to tell Charlotte he was leaving, she had been plating the food. When he returned, the plates on the table were still empty. The food he'd seen her plating was in the kitchen, covered, untouched. She hadn't sat down to eat. She hadn't served herself. She'd stood in the kitchen for however long after he left, and then she'd left herself, without eating. Without touching the table, she'd spent hours preparing. That image, Charlotte standing alone in the kitchen, the plated food in front of her, deciding, sat somewhere under his sternum and didn't move. By 3 in the morning, Dom's team had run through every hotel within 30 miles, every known associate of Charlotte's, every location they could cross-reference from her last 6 months of routine. Nothing. At 3:40, one of the tech guys found something. Security footage from the exterior of the mansion, the camera mounted on the east gate post, showed Charlotte walking out through the pedestrian gate at 9:02 p.m., 48 minutes after Vincent had left. She was carrying one bag. She walked east along the lakefront path. She didn't look back. She also appeared to have noticed the camera. As she passed beneath it, she tilted her head slightly downward, not enough to hide her face, just enough to acknowledge that she knew it was there, that she wasn't trying to disappear entirely, only to leave on her own terms. Vincent watched that footage 6 times. At 4 in the morning, he went upstairs to their bedroom. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for. He stood in the middle of the room for a while, looking at the ordinary evidence of their shared life. The books on her nightstand, the cardigan draped over the reading chair, the framed photograph from their wedding on the dresser, which he noticed had been moved about 3 inches to the left. He opened her closet. She hadn't taken much. A third of her clothes were gone, he estimated, the practical ones. Items you'd need for an indefinite but not permanent absence. She wasn't running away forever. She'd taken what she'd need to be gone long enough for something to happen. He didn't know yet what that something was. In the back of the closet, on the shelf where she kept old photographs and documents she didn't need regularly but hadn't thrown away, he found a small wooden box he didn't recognize. It was the kind of box that might hold jewelry, but it was unlocked and empty. Except it wasn't entirely empty. In the bottom, a folded square of paper. He unfolded it. Start here. C. Just that. 2 words and an initial. He sat on the edge of the bed with the note in his hand, and he thought, she didn't leave. She left a trail. He was still sitting there when the sun came up over the lake and filled the room with gray winter light, and he understood slowly and with a heaviness he wasn't expecting that whatever Charlotte had left behind was not a goodbye. It was a test. Or an invitation. He wasn't yet sure which. What he was sure of, the only thing he was absolutely certain of as he sat in that gray morning light, with her note in one hand, and the knowledge of his own failure settling across his shoulders like a coat he couldn't take off, was that he had spent 14 months married to a woman who had never once asked him to choose her. And on the one night she'd set the good china and lit real candles and put on the cream-colored dress, he had walked out the door for someone else. He set the note on her pillow. Then he stood up, put his coat back on, and went to find her. The wooden box sat on Vincent's desk by 7 in the morning, next to a cold cup of coffee he hadn't touched, and a legal pad with 3 words written on it and crossed out. Dom stood across from him, jacket still on, the kind of tired that lives behind the eyes rather than in the body. He'd been up all night running names and addresses and coming back empty, and the emptiness was starting to show in the set of his jaw. A tightness that Vincent recognized because he'd seen it in mirrors. We've got nothing on her location, Dom said. No pings on her cell since 9:06 last night. Phone's either off or she pulled the SIM. She pulled it. Yeah. Dom looked at the box. What's in it? A note. 2 words. Dom waited. Start here. Vincent turned the small square of paper over in his fingers. She left me a starting point. I just don't know what I'm starting. Starting where, though? That's nothing. That's 2 words on a piece of paper. It's Charlotte. Vincent set the paper down flat on the desk. She doesn't waste words. If she wrote 2 words, those are the exact 2 words she meant, and there's a specific place or thing she wants me to look at first. He paused. She knew I'd searched the bedroom. She put the box where I'd find it, but not immediately. She wanted me to look at the surface stuff first, the clothes, the closet, the obvious signs, and then find the real starting point after. Dom rubbed the back of his neck. So she planned all of this. The timing, the trail, everything. For a while, I think. How long? Vincent didn't answer because the answer was a number he wasn't ready to say out loud. If Charlotte had built something like this, layered, patient, precise, then it hadn't come together in a week. It hadn't come together in a month. And that meant she'd been carrying it alongside every ordinary day they'd shared, every dinner, every morning, every night he'd reached across the bed and found her there. And she had been keeping this whole other architecture of knowledge and intention running quietly underneath all of it. That required a kind of sustained, deliberate effort that made his chest feel like something was compressing it from the outside. Get Rains, he said. Dom's expression shifted slightly. Rains. I need someone who thinks like she does. Rains is the closest I've got. Elena Rains was the Moretti organization's head of intelligence operations, a title that didn't fully describe what she did, which was closer to institutional memory combined with forensic paranoia. She'd been with the family for 11 years, recruited out of a private investigations firm in D.C., where she'd spent 4 years building financial cases against people who were very good at not being found. She was 51, chronically underdressed for every occasion, and she had a way of looking at a room that made you feel like she was filing everything simultaneously. She arrived at the mansion at 7:40. Vincent walked her through the dining room without explaining, let her see the table, the melted candles, the empty plates, the ring where he'd left it. She stood in the center of the room for about 30 seconds without speaking. She set this up to be found, Rains said. Yes. The ring's positioned deliberately. Middle of the table would be dramatic. Against the candlestick is considered. She turned. The food was fully prepared? Plated. In the kitchen. She cooked the full meal. Yes. That took time, probably started cooking around 6:30, which means she made a decision to leave after she'd already committed to staying. Rains looked at him with the flat, information-processing gaze she used for everything. Something happened between when she started cooking and when she left, or she was waiting to see if something would happen. Vincent thought about the phone call coming at 8:14. Charlotte in the kitchen, him in the doorway, Olivia's voice on the other end. The way Charlotte had said okay without fighting it. She was waiting, he said. She was waiting to see what I'd do. Rains looked at him for a moment. She didn't offer anything. That was what he paid her for. He took her upstairs and showed her the box, the shelf, the closet. She moved through the room with her hands behind her back, not touching anything yet, just looking. She bent down to examine the shelf at eye level, tilted her head, straightened. There's dust displacement here, she said, along the back of the shelf. Something was stored against the wall for a long time and then removed. Recently. She straightened. The box wasn't the only thing on this shelf. What else? Whatever she took with her. She looked around the closet slowly. She was using this space for storage. Not clothes storage, document storage. Vincent's jaw tightened. How long? Based on the dust pattern? A year, minimum, maybe longer. He walked back out of the closet and stood in the center of the bedroom and thought about what it meant to live alongside someone for 14 months of marriage, coming home to this room, sleeping in that bed, and having no idea that 12 feet away behind the hanging coats, there was a shelf filling up with something he wasn't supposed to see. He thought about whether he would have looked if he'd known. He thought about whether that question said something about him that he didn't particularly want to examine. Find the starting point, he told Rains. Whatever start here means, find it. She was already pulling on a pair of thin examination gloves. By 10 in the morning, it was Marco Vitelli who showed up at the mansion without being called. Marco was 63 and had been Vincent's underboss for 9 years, the kind of man who filled a room with his presence not through aggression, but through a certain gravitational stillness. The sense that he'd seen enough of everything to be no longer surprised by any of it. He'd grown up 2 streets over from Vincent in the old neighborhood. He'd attended Vincent's father's funeral. He had also attended the quiet civil ceremony where Vincent married Charlotte, and afterward, over drinks, he'd told Vincent, "That one's smarter than she lets on. Don't underestimate her." Vincent had thought it was a compliment. He was only now starting to understand what Marco had actually meant. Marco sat down across the desk without being invited, poured himself coffee from the carafe without asking, and looked at Vincent with the unhurried attention of someone who has already processed his own reaction to bad news and moved past it. "Talk," Vincent said. "I heard." "From who?" "Dom. He called me at 6. Marco wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "What do you know so far?" Vincent told him about the box, the shelf, the dust pattern. Marco listened without interrupting, which was one of his qualities Vincent most relied on, and occasionally most resented. When Vincent finished, Marco set his cup down. "She was doing her own investigation," Marco said. "It wasn't a question." "That's what it looks like." "Of what?" "I don't know yet." Marco was quiet for a moment. "You have a theory." "I have the beginning of one." "Say it." Vincent looked at him. "Someone in the organization. Someone close enough that she didn't feel she could come to me directly. Someone she needed to build an airtight case against before she said anything, because if she said something without enough to back it up, she knew I might not believe her, or the person might find out before she was ready." The room was very quiet. The lake outside the window was flat and gray under a thick sky. Marco said, "That narrows it down." "Yes," Vincent said, "it does." There were maybe 11 people in the Moretti syndicate, with enough proximity to the center of operations to warrant the kind of sustained, covert investigation Charlotte appeared to have been running. 11 people whose movements, communications, and financial activities would actually matter. 11 people whose loyalty Vincent had staked his organization on. Neither of them said any names, not yet. That was a door you didn't open until you had a reason that would hold up. The call from Edward Callahan came at 11:15. Edward was the Moretti Consigliere, a title that traced back to the old organizational structures, but which in practice meant something closer to institutional architect. He'd built the legal scaffolding around the Moretti syndicate 30 years ago, had helped Vincent's father weather 3 federal investigations without a single indictment, and had continued in that role into Vincent's tenure with a kind of permanent authority that came less from position than from the simple fact that he knew where everything was buried because he'd helped bury most of it. He was 67, dressed always in gray or navy, spoke in precise measured sentences, and had never in Vincent's memory displayed anything resembling panic, which was why the slight irregularity in his voice when he called registered immediately. "I heard about Charlotte," Edward said. "I wanted to call." "How did you hear?" A brief pause. "Dom mentioned it this morning when I called about the Riverside permits. I hope you don't mind." Dom hadn't mentioned calling Edward. Vincent filed that and kept his voice neutral. "I appreciate the call. Is there anything I can do? I have connections at the bureau level if you think it might be relevant." "No," Vincent said. "Not yet. I appreciate the offer." "Of course." Another slightly longer than conversational. "Vincent, if there's anything Charlotte may have been troubled by, anything she shared with you that might help explain—" "She didn't share anything with me," Vincent said, which was the truth. "That's what I'm working through." "I understand. Well, you know where I am." The call ended. Vincent set the phone face down on the desk. Marco had heard his half of the conversation. He was watching Vincent with the expression he used when he was deciding whether to say something. "Say it," Vincent said. "Edward called Dom this morning about permits," Marco said. "That's not unusual. But Dom didn't mention calling Edward." "No." "So either Dom forgot to mention it, which Dom doesn't do, or Edward called Dom specifically to find out what was being said before he called me." Marco picked up his coffee again. "He was fishing." "Yeah. That doesn't tell you much." "No," Vincent agreed, "but it's the first thing that doesn't fit." By noon, Rains had found the starting point. It wasn't in the bedroom. It was in Charlotte's home office, a room Vincent rarely entered because Charlotte had made clear early in their marriage, with characteristic directness and zero hostility, that it was her space, which he'd respected because he had his own study downstairs, and because he understood the need for territory that belonged entirely to yourself. Rains had gone through the office systematically, starting with the most obvious hiding places and working outward. What she found was behind the built-in bookshelves, specifically behind a complete set of Illinois state legal codes that no one had opened in years, wedged between the volumes and the back wall. A flat manila envelope, sealed, with a single word written on the front in Charlotte's handwriting. Vincent. He opened it at the desk in the office, Rain standing to his side, while downstairs he could hear Dom moving around and the low murmur of two of his security team talking in the kitchen. Inside, a USB drive, a folded letter, 4 pages, dense, handwritten, and a photograph. He looked at the photograph first. It showed a man he recognized, a mid-level Moretti accountant named Gary Swanson, one of 3 people who managed the organization's offshore accounts, sitting at a restaurant table across from another man whose face was partially obscured, but whose build, posture, and particular way of holding his head were recognizable enough to hit Vincent like a fist to the sternum. He didn't say anything for a moment. Rains waited. "That's Swanson," he said. "Yes." "And the other man?" "I had to run it through enhancement," Rains said. "The angle's not ideal, but based on build, age, and what's visible of the facial structure, I know who it is." He set the photograph down and picked up the letter. Charlotte's handwriting was small and consistent, the penmanship of someone who'd learned to write carefully because she'd grown up with a father who made her rewrite assignments until they were done right. He'd always found it strangely moving, that handwriting, the care in it. He read the first paragraph standing. Then he sat down. The letter was a methodical account, written without drama or editorial excess, of 14 months of observation. Charlotte had not gone looking for trouble. She had stumbled onto the first anomaly by accident, a discrepancy in a charitable trust document she'd been reviewing on Vincent's behalf because his legal team was short-staffed during a reorganization. And then, rather than come to him immediately with something she wasn't yet sure about, she had quietly continued looking. And continued finding things. Money moving through subsidiary accounts in patterns that didn't match the legitimate business structures. Communications that had been routed around the standard Moretti channels in ways that would be invisible unless you were looking for them specifically. Charitable donations made in the family's name to organizations that, when Charlotte cross-referenced them against federal nonprofit registries, didn't appear to exist. And woven through all of it, the same careful fingerprints, not Swanson's because Swanson was clearly a middleman, the access point rather than the architect, but someone with deep structural knowledge of the Moretti financial systems, someone who had been inside the organization long enough to know which threads could be pulled without the whole thing unraveling, someone who understood the blind spots in the family's internal auditing, because they had helped design those blind spots. Vincent read the letter twice. He was on his second pass through the 3rd page when Dom appeared in the doorway. Dom took one look at him and said, "What?" "Close the door," Vincent said. Dom closed it. He came and stood in front of the desk, and Vincent turned the letter around and pushed it across to him, keeping the photograph face down for now. Dom read. He read slowly, which was unusual for him, which meant he was reading every word. When he finished the 3rd page, he looked up. His face had the particular quality of a man who has just heard something confirm a suspicion he'd been hoping was wrong. "This is serious," Dom said. "Yes. If this is what she's saying it is, Vincent, this is years of... Someone has been running a separate operation inside the family, taking money, building something we can't see from the inside." "I know. Who else has read this?" "Rains found it. She knows what's in the envelope." Dom looked at Rains. She met his eyes without expression. "The USB," Dom said. "We haven't opened it yet," Rains said. "I was waiting." Dom pulled a laptop from the shelf behind him, one of the secure machines they kept in the office, never connected to external networks, and opened it. Rains inserted the drive. 47 files. A mix of document scans, audio recordings, and video files, all labeled with dates and short descriptors in Charlotte's naming system. Clear, functional, no ambiguity. The first video file they opened was 38 seconds of footage from what appeared to be a restaurant security camera, the angle high and slightly distorted, but the 2 figures at the table completely recognizable. Swanson and the second man, the one in the photograph, sitting across from each other with drinks and documents between them. The audio was quiet and partially obscured, but audible enough, in certain stretches, for isolated phrases to be distinguished. Rains plugged in the laptop's speakers and turned the volume up. The second man's voice came through in fragments, but it was enough. Voice pattern, cadence, that particular slight formality in the phrasing. Vincent knew it the way you know someone's footstep on a staircase after years of hearing it. He reached out and pressed pause. He sat there with his hand still on the laptop. Dom had gone very still on the other side of the desk. "Vincent," Dom said, quietly, "I heard it. I know who it is. We need to be completely sure before—" Vincent pressed play. Let it run to the end of the audio segment. Set the phrases against his memory of the voice, the real voice, the voice he'd heard twice a week for 9 years in boardrooms and over dinner and at the funerals of men they'd both known. Compared the posture in the grainy footage against the posture he'd watched across tables and through windows and in the passenger seat of cars during long drives to meetings in other cities. He pressed stop. "It's Edward," he said. Dom said nothing. "Charlotte knew," Vincent said. "She built this case because she knew and she needed it to be undeniable before she could bring it to me. Because she understood that I would resist believing it. Because she understood that Edward is the one person in this organization whose loyalty I have never once questioned in my adult life." He heard his own voice doing something at the edges. Not breaking, just slightly wrong, slightly compressed, the way a wall sounds when the structure behind it is shifting. And she was right. Even now, sitting here looking at this, part of me is looking for the alternative explanation. Because it might not be— "Play the third audio file," Vincent said to Rains. She found it and played it. This one was cleaner, recorded indoors, presumably, with a microphone placed closer to the source. The voice was unmistakable. The conversation concerned, in careful but decipherable language, the movement of funds through 3 specific accounts, the suppression of a security review that had been scheduled for the previous year, and a reference, oblique but clear to anyone who knew the Moretti operational structure, to a planned expansion of the arrangement into 2 new subsidiary channels. When it ended, the room was completely quiet except for the sound of the lake outside. Dom had his arms crossed, looking at the floor. He looked up. "She's been building this for over a year," he said. "By herself, no backup." "She had a plan if something happened to her," Vincent said. He thought of the contingency Charlotte had referenced in the letter's final page, the encrypted copy of everything, the instructions for its release, the conditions under which it would be automatically sent to a federal contact whose name she had deliberately not included in this copy of the letter. She'd protected herself. She'd protected the evidence. And she'd protected him too by not telling him early enough that he might accidentally alert the one person who needed to not be alerted. "She left," Dom said slowly, as though working it out as he spoke, "because she'd finished the case. She'd built it to the point where it could stand without her, and she left it for you because she needed you to find it yourself, to make the decision yourself, without her standing next to you telling you what to think." Vincent looked at him. "She trusted me to get here on my own." "Which you did. It took me all night and most of the morning, and I still almost missed the box in the closet. But you got here." He picked up the photograph again, looked at Edward Callahan's partially obscured face across the restaurant table. 30 years of history, 30 years of advice and loyalty, and the kind of steady institutional presence that you started to take for granted the way you take for granted the walls of a building. Not something you think about, just something that's always been there, and that you assume will continue to be there because it always has been. He set the photograph down. "I want to know where the money went," he said. "All of it. Every account, every subsidiary, every shell that Swanson touched. I want it mapped before tonight." "That's going to take— I don't care what it takes." His voice came out level and final. "And I want surveillance on Edward. Full coverage, phone movement, meetings. Nothing that alerts him. Nothing that looks different from any other Tuesday." Dom nodded. He was already moving toward the door. "Dom." He stopped. "Nobody else in the leadership hears about this. Not yet. Not until I know exactly who knew and for how long." Dom's jaw tightened slightly. He understood what that meant. That the circle of people Vincent currently trusted had just collapsed to about 4 individuals, one of whom was a woman who wasn't in the building and whom Vincent wasn't even sure he'd be able to find. "Understood," Dom said. He left. Rains began making copies of every file on the drive, moving with the systematic calm she brought to everything. Vincent watched her for a moment, then picked up the letter again and turned to the last page. Charlotte had written, at the bottom, below the final evidentiary notes and the instructions about the contingency copy, "I know this is going to hurt. I know Edward feels like something permanent to you. So did I once, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, this is what I found, this is what I can prove, and this is yours to do something with. Don't rush it. Do it right." He read those last four words twice. Do it right. He thought of Olivia's voice on the phone, the fear that had sounded real, that maybe was real, that had been real enough to move him out the door and away from the one night Charlotte had asked, without asking, for him to stay. He thought about how easy it had been to leave, how automatic. He thought about Charlotte standing alone in the kitchen after he'd gone, the plated food in front of her, and then making the decision, not in anger, not in grief, but with the same steady, patient deliberateness she brought to everything, to pick up her bag and walk through the gate and not look back at the camera. That was when his phone rang for the third time that morning. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. He answered. A voice he didn't immediately recognize, male, controlled, the kind of deliberate flatness that comes from someone choosing their words in advance. Mr. Moretti, you don't know me, but I know what your wife found. And I know that if Edward Callahan finds out what you're doing in that office right now, she won't be the only one who disappears. Vincent didn't move, didn't breathe differently, didn't change his expression. Who is this? He said. Someone who gave Charlotte information she couldn't have gotten on her own. A brief pause. Someone Edward is going to come looking for very soon, and when he does, if you haven't moved first, everything your wife built is going to disappear along with the people who helped her build it. The line went dead. Vincent stood in the center of Charlotte's office with the phone in his hand, the sounds of Rains working at the desk behind him, and the lake going flat and gray outside the window, and understood with the full and irreversible clarity of a door swinging shut that whatever controlled and careful process he'd been planning, the measured surveillance, the mapped accounts, the patient construction of an undeniable case, had just been stripped of the one thing it depended on: time. Vincent stood there for 3 full seconds after the line went dead, which was 3 seconds longer than he normally allowed himself to do nothing. Then he turned to Rains. How long to copy everything on that drive? 12 minutes. You have 8. She didn't argue. She moved faster. He walked out of Charlotte's office and down the hall to the top of the stairs and stood there looking down at the foyer below, where 2 of his security team were posted near the front door in the particular stillness of men who have been told to stay alert without being told why. He could hear Dom on a call somewhere in the back of the house, his voice low and clipped. He could hear the lake outside, a faint, persistent sound, like something breathing. He went back into the office. Rains, the man on the phone, someone who gave Charlotte information she couldn't get on her own, who inside the organization had access to Edward's financial movements that Charlotte wouldn't have been able to reach herself. Rains didn't look up from the laptop. Accounting tier or legal? Either. Both. Swanson's the obvious name, but Swanson is Edward's man based on what we just saw, so not Swanson. She ejected a backup drive and inserted another. Someone in accounting who wasn't Swanson, or someone in the legal structure who had lateral visibility into the offshore accounts without being directly inside them. Peter Cho, Vincent said. Rains paused for exactly half a second. Cho handles tax compliance. He'd have visibility into the structures without being the one who built them. Charlotte knew Peter. They'd worked together twice when she was reviewing documents for me. He trusted her. Vincent moved to the window. The lake outside was the color of old iron. He saw something he couldn't bring to me directly because bringing it to me meant going through Edward. And Edward is the one who recommended Cho for the position, Rains said. Yes. So Cho has been sitting on this, feeding Charlotte what he could, knowing that if Edward found out he'd disappear, Vincent said. That's what the voice meant. Edward is going to come looking. Cho is already exposed or close to it. He pulled out his phone and called Dom. Dom picked up on the first ring. Yeah. Peter Cho, find him, right now. Don't call him. Send someone physical to his location and bring him in without using the regular channels. Don't route anything through the main dispatch. A beat. You think the main channels are compromised? I think I don't know what's compromised and what isn't, so we use nothing that passes through Edward's visibility. Can you do that? Give me 20 minutes. You have 15. He hung up. Rains finished the copies at the 9-minute mark, which was the closest she ever came to a complement of his timeline. She handed him 2 backup drives and kept one herself, and then she looked at him with the flat information processing gaze that had never once, in his experience, been wrong about the emotional temperature of a situation. You're about to do something fast, she said. I'm about to do what needs doing. Charlotte's letter said don't rush it. Charlotte wrote that letter before someone called me to tell me the window is closing. He pocketed the drives. She built the case for conditions that no longer exist. Rains held his eyes for a moment. She didn't push. She knew him well enough to know when the argument was over, and she knew herself well enough not to waste the next sentence on a door that was already shut. He went downstairs. Peter Cho arrived at the mansion at 11:47, brought in through the service entrance in the back of a car with tinted windows by two of Dom's men who hadn't been told anything beyond a location and a name. He was 44, compact, usually precise in his movements and appearance. He arrived with his tie loosened and a quality of barely managed panic living just under the surface of his expression, the kind that a man produces when he has been waiting for something terrible to happen and has just realized it's today. Vincent met him in the downstairs study. Not the main office, not any room with windows facing the front approach. He sat behind the desk and waited for Cho to settle into the chair across from him, which Cho did with the careful deliberateness of someone trying not to show that his hands weren't entirely steady. "You called me this morning," Vincent said. No greeting, no preamble. Cho's composure fractured exactly the way Vincent expected it to. Not all at once, but in one small visible place, a slight tightening around the eyes that he immediately tried to suppress and couldn't quite manage. "I don't know what you mean," Cho said. "Peter." Vincent kept his voice level, the way he kept it level in every conversation where the wrong tone would make the other person shut down rather than open up. "I'm not interested in whether you called me. I know you called me. What I need to know is how much time we have and what you know that Charlotte couldn't get on her own." Cho looked at him for a moment. Something moved through his face, a calculation, a decision being made. The precise internal moment when a person stops deciding whether to trust someone and simply commits. 6 years, Cho said. Edward has been running a parallel financial structure inside the family for at least 6 years, possibly 8. I've only been able to verify 6. Vincent breathed. What kind of structure? He's been extracting capital from the legitimate business operations. Skimming, essentially, but at a level of sophistication that makes traditional skimming look like someone stealing from the register. He set it up during the reorganization of the subsidiary accounts in 2018. He used the reorganization as cover to introduce routing architecture that nobody below the top tier would understand well enough to question. Swanson. Swanson is the access point. He processes the movements, doesn't understand the full picture. He thinks he's doing compliance adjustments. Cho leaned forward slightly. But that's not the part that matters most. Say the part that matters most. Cho exhaled. The money isn't going into Edward's personal accounts. It's not personal enrichment. The capital is being accumulated in a consolidated external structure, so multiple layers of shell entities, mostly offshore, some domestic. And it's been used to quietly acquire controlling interests in 6 legitimate businesses that operate adjacent to the Moretti territory. Vincent felt something shift in his understanding of the situation, the way the ground shifts before you realize you've been standing on unstable surface. He's building a parallel empire. He's been building it for 6 years, using your money. And in approximately 18 months, based on the acquisition trajectory Charlotte and I were tracking, those 6 businesses will have enough market presence and legal clean standing that they could operate entirely independently of the Moretti syndicate. At which point the family becomes redundant, Vincent said. He doesn't need us anymore. He walks away with a clean, legitimate empire funded on the back of 30 years of our operation. Or, Cho said, and the single word carried a weight that stopped Vincent mid-thought. He doesn't walk away. He uses the legal empire as leverage, applies pressure. The Moretti syndicate starts losing territory because certain legitimate businesses that you depend on for cover start refusing to cooperate. Supply chains, legal contacts, business fronts. They all start going sideways at once. And the only way to stabilize it is to restructure. And the restructuring, when it happens, looks like Edward stepping into a formal leadership role. The room was so quiet that Vincent could hear Rains moving upstairs, the faint creak of the floorboards, and Dom's voice somewhere distant in the back of the house. He's not stealing from us, Vincent said slowly. He's buying us. He's been buying the conditions of your surrender for 6 years. Cho's voice was flat now, the panic having burned off into something colder and more deliberate. And Charlotte saw it. She didn't just see the financial irregularities, she saw where they were going. That's what made her case different from just an accounting discrepancy. She understood the end game. Why didn't she come to me? It wasn't really a question, but Cho answered it anyway. She tried. 8 months ago. Not directly. She left documents on your desk. Financial summaries she'd prepared in a format that looked like regular review materials. She wanted to see if you'd notice the anomalies yourself. Vincent went very still. You didn't look at them, Cho said. Not an accusation, just a statement. She told me afterward. She waited 3 weeks and you never mentioned it. He remembered. Not the documents themselves. He hadn't read them with any real attention, had filed them as routine materials, had intended to go back to them, and had not. He remembered Charlotte asking him, once, casually, whether he'd gone through the financial summaries she'd left. He'd said he'd glanced at them. She'd said okay and changed the subject. That was 8 months ago. She'd spent the 8 months since building the case to the standard where it couldn't be ignored even by someone who wasn't looking. He sat with that for exactly as long as he could afford to sit with it, which was about 4 seconds. And then he set it aside because the alternative was to stop functioning, and he couldn't stop functioning. Who else knows what you know? He asked. No one inside the organization. Outside. Cho hesitated. Charlotte has a federal contact. I don't know who. She never told me the name. She said it was safer if the chain was broken there. She mentioned the contingency in her letter, files that get released automatically if she doesn't check in within a certain window. Yes. Cho looked at him steadily. She set it up before she left, which means the window is already running. How long? I don't know the exact parameters. She didn't tell me the specifics for the same reason she didn't tell me the federal contact's name. She was protecting me from being a useful source of information under pressure. He paused. She's careful. She was careful about everyone. Vincent looked at him for a long moment. Does Edward know about you? The fear came back into Cho's face then. Not the controlled near panic from before, but something rawer, the specific fear of a man who has been asking himself this question for weeks and still doesn't have a reliable answer. I think he suspects, Cho said. I think he noticed a pattern in my access requests over the past 3 months. He hasn't done anything yet, which might mean he's watching me. Or it might mean he's waiting until he's identified everyone in the chain before he moves on any of us. You need to not go back to your office. I know. You need to not contact anyone using your regular phone or email. I know. Cho's jaw tightened. Mr. Moretti, I've been sitting on this for 18 months waiting for Charlotte to be ready to move. I know exactly what the exposure looks like. Dom appeared in the doorway. Vincent looked up. Dom's expression said something had happened. Give us a minute, Vincent said to Cho. He stood and stepped into the hall, pulling the door mostly closed behind him. Dom kept his voice down. Swanson is gone. Gone. He didn't show up to his office this morning. His apartment's cleaned out. Not ransacked, cleaned. Someone packed efficiently and left. His car is still in the building garage. Dom looked at him with the flat directness of a man delivering news he knows is bad. Someone told him to run. When? Based on the building's entry logs, he came home at around midnight. He was gone before 6 this morning. Vincent did the math without meaning to. Midnight was roughly the same time he'd been sitting in the dining room in the dark with the burned-out candles. Edward had moved Swanson, his most direct access point to the financial evidence, within hours of Charlotte's disappearance becoming known to the organization, which meant Edward had known about Charlotte's departure almost immediately, which meant someone who knew had told him or he'd had surveillance of his own on the mansion. Neither option was comfortable. There's more, Dom said. Say it. The security footage from the East Gate, the footage showing Charlotte leaving. It was accessed remotely this morning at 6:14. Someone pulled the files. From outside. From outside using credentials that belong to a server account that shouldn't have remote access enabled. Dom paused. It's the kind of access that requires someone who built the security infrastructure. The security infrastructure of the Moretti mansion had been designed 8 years ago. Edward Callahan had been present for every consultation. He hadn't built it himself, but he'd been in the room for every decision about what it would look like. He knows she left, Vincent said. He knows she left voluntarily, not under duress, which means he knows she planned it. And if he knows she planned it, Dom said, he knows she left something behind. Vincent turned and went back into the study. Cho was still sitting in the chair, upright, waiting. He looked like a man practicing being calm. We need to move, Vincent said. Not from here. From this timeline. Edward is already ahead of us by several moves. He's moved Swanson, he's pulled security footage, and he's had 12 hours to think about what Charlotte left in this house. Has he done anything to Charlotte? Cho asked. I don't think so. If he knew where she was, we'd be dealing with a different kind of problem right now. Vincent picked up one of the backup drives from the desk. What he doesn't know is where she is or what exactly she took with her when she left, which is the one piece of leverage we have: the federal contingency. She built it so it would release automatically, which means even if Edward found her tonight, the evidence doesn't disappear with her. He knows that. He's not going to touch her unless he's desperate. Vincent paused. He's going to try to get ahead of the evidence, discredit it, build an alternative narrative that he can present to the family before I can present Charlotte's case. How? I don't know yet. He looked at Dom. Get the full leadership together for this evening, 7 o'clock. Use the usual meeting location. Don't change anything that looks different from normal operations. Tell them it's a routine quarterly review. Dom's eyes narrowed slightly. You're going to let Edward walk into a meeting where you already know. I need to see who else walks in knowing, Vincent said. Edward didn't build 6 years of financial architecture by himself. He had help from inside the room. Dom absorbed that. The implication settled over him visibly. The understanding that the circle of compromised people might extend beyond Edward and Swanson into the leadership tier where Dom himself operated, where the men Vincent had trusted with his organization's survival sat and made decisions and had dinner and attended each other's children's weddings. You're sure? Dom said. No, Vincent said. That's why I need the meeting. At 4 in the afternoon, Raines brought him a financial map, a physical document printed on 3 large sheets of paper, showing the account movements Cho had described as best she could reconstruct them from the files on Charlotte's drive. The structure was visible on paper in a way it hadn't been in description. The elegant branching architecture of it, the way the capital had been moved in small, individually unremarkable amounts through dozens of intermediary accounts before being consolidated, the way the shell entities were layered so that no single layer, examined in isolation, would trigger a compliance alert. It was beautiful work, in the way that a particular kind of damage is beautiful, the way you can look at something and recognize the intelligence behind it, even as it destroys something you valued. Charlotte mapped all of this, Raines said. That took months. She was doing financial forensics at a professional level. She has a law degree. She has a law degree she never used professionally because she married you and moved into the background. Raines let that sentence stand on its own for a moment. She spent a year using the skills she put down when she married into this family to build a case against the man who's been dismantling it from the inside. Vincent looked at the map. He thought about Charlotte at the kitchen table with documents spread in front of her, cross-referencing account structures at 11 at night while he was at some meeting or dinner or obligation that he'd thought was more important. He thought about how rarely he'd asked what she was working on, how rarely he'd been in the room long enough to wonder. At 6:15, 45 minutes before the meeting, Vincent was in his downstairs office when his phone buzzed with a text from an unsaved number. No text, just a photograph. He opened it. The photograph showed a hand, a woman's hand, the fingers slender and pale, resting on what appeared to be a library table. On the ring finger, no ring. On the wrist, the small scar she'd gotten from a bicycle accident at 11 years old that she'd told him about during their second month together, lying on his couch, talking about childhood the way you do when you're starting to let someone in. Below the photograph, a single line of text. She's safe. She's watching. Don't do anything tonight that she wouldn't do. He stared at that line for a long time. The phrasing, not don't do anything rash or be careful, but specifically, don't do anything she wouldn't do. It was Charlotte's standard, her particular discipline, the refusal to act on emotion when evidence and patience would serve better, the willingness to sit with something difficult rather than resolve it violently and quickly. He set the phone face down on the desk. Then he picked up his jacket, straightened it, and walked toward the door that led to the meeting where Edward Callahan would be sitting in the room and looking at him with 30 years of performed loyalty arranged across his face like furniture in a staged house, and where Vincent would have to sit across from that face and perform his own ignorance, because Charlotte wouldn't have walked in there and exploded everything on the strength of anger alone. He got as far as the hallway. Then Dom came through the back entrance moving fast, in the way Dom moved only when something had gone wrong in a way that couldn't be walked back, and the expression on his face was the specific expression of a man who has received information that has changed the shape of everything. Edward called the meeting, Dom said. He sent out a separate summons 40 minutes ago, direct to the leadership. He said you authorized it. I didn't. No, you didn't. Dom's voice was tight and controlled in the way it got when he was managing something large. He told them there's been a development regarding Charlotte. He told them she's been in contact with federal investigators. The hallway was very quiet. "He's moving first," Vincent said. "He's moving first," Dom confirmed, "and he's framing it as a security crisis. He's going to walk into that room and tell the leadership that Charlotte is a federal informant, that she's been feeding information to investigators for over a year, and that her disappearance is either a witness protection arrangement or a deliberate provocation." Vincent felt the full weight of what that meant. Edward wasn't going to try to quietly bury the evidence. He was going to do something more brutal and more effective. He was going to make Charlotte the threat. He was going to take every piece of her investigation and reframe it as the actions of a woman working against the family, which, from the outside, from the perspective of a leadership council that hadn't seen what was on Charlotte's drive, would look almost plausible. A woman who married the boss, who had access to documents, who had quietly been doing research for over a year, who had vanished the night a crisis pulled her husband out of the house. "If the leadership believes him before I get into that room," Vincent said, "Charlotte becomes someone they want found for the wrong reasons." "That's the play," Dom said. "He gets the leadership to authorize a search for her as a security threat before you can show them what she actually found. And a search authorized by the family for a federal informant doesn't end the same way a husband looking for his wife ends." Vincent stood in the hallway with that understanding moving through him like something cold and final, a temperature drop that happened below the skin rather than on it. He had 40 minutes before the meeting. He had Charlotte's evidence on 2 drives in his pocket and one with Rain's. He had Cho in a secured room upstairs. He had Dom in front of him. He had a financial map on 3 sheets of paper in his office. And he had an unknown federal contact somewhere in Charlotte's contingency plan, a chain he couldn't complete because Charlotte had deliberately broken it to protect the people in it. He also had one thing that Edward, for all his 6 years of careful construction, had apparently failed to account for: the photograph. The text. The confirmation, 45 minutes ago, that Charlotte was watching. She knew the timeline. She knew Edward well enough to know he would move fast when cornered. She had sent that message not as reassurance, but as instruction. Don't do anything she wouldn't do, because she had anticipated this exact moment, the moment when the temptation to walk in and detonate everything would be enormous, and she needed him to understand that the evidence was the weapon, not the anger. "The meeting," Vincent said. "Who confirmed attendance?" 7 of the 12, the other 5 haven't responded. "Who confirmed?" Dom listed the names. Vincent listened to each one. When Dom finished, Vincent said, "Which of those 7 did you personally contact using our secure channel, and which did you contact through the standard dispatch?" Dom went very still. The question did what it was designed to do, forced him to map the confirmation path against the channels that Edward had potential visibility into. 3 through secure, Dom said, 4 through standard. "So Edward knows which 4 are coming. He might not know the other 3. "Right. Then those are the 3 I trust going in." Vincent buttoned his jacket. "Get them to the meeting location before Edward gets there. Not inside, outside. I need them positioned." "For what?" "For the moment when I walk in and give Edward exactly what he thinks he wants," Vincent said, "and then show him what Charlotte actually built." He started moving toward the door. Dom kept pace. "Vincent." Dom's voice was low. "If this goes wrong in that room, if even 2 of the 12 are Edward's, I know." "That's not a small I know. That's I know what it is." Vincent stopped and turned to face him directly, and Dom saw in his expression something that wasn't anger and wasn't fear and wasn't confidence, something more complicated than any of those, the specific combination of a man who has spent 20 years making decisions from a position of power and is now making one from a position of having nothing left to protect, except the thing he should have been protecting all along. "I'm walking into that room with the truth, and I'm going to stand there and hold it until it holds up or it doesn't. That's what she built this for. That's what she left it for me to do." He paused. "Now let's go." They went. The meeting location was a private dining room on the 14th floor of a building the Moretti Syndicate controlled through a hospitality subsidiary, a room with no windows on the street side, and 2 exits and a kitchen staff that had been vetted to the point of tedium. Vincent arrived 11 minutes before 7. Edward Callahan was already there. He was standing at the far end of the table with a glass of water in his hand, and the expression of a man who is performing composure because the alternative is acknowledging that the room has changed around him in ways he didn't fully control. He looked, Vincent thought, exactly like a man who had been planning something for 6 years and had just felt the first tremor of doubt about whether it was going to work. "Vincent," Edward said. His voice was warm, careful, carrying the register of someone who has decided on a particular emotional approach and is committed to it. "I'm glad you're here. I wanted to reach you directly, but things moved quickly this afternoon. I'm sure Dom told you." "He told me." Vincent moved to the head of the table, his position, the one Edward was not standing at because Edward understood the value of not overreaching too early, and set his jacket on the chair without sitting yet. "Tell me what you know about Charlotte, Edward." Edward's expression organized itself into concern. It was convincing. It had probably convinced a large number of people over a long number of years. "I've had some troubling information come to me today," Edward said. "I want to share it with the full council, in the interest of transparency. But since you're here, I'm glad to—" "The council will hear it when they're all in the room," Vincent said. "Sit down." A pause. Edward sat. The other 11 men filtered in over the next 6 minutes. Vincent watched each entrance, watched each face as it registered the temperature of the room, the careful neutrality he was maintaining at the head of the table, the slightly stiff quality in Edward's posture, the absence of the usual small talk that preceded these meetings. Some of them understood immediately that something was wrong. Others took longer. When all 12 chairs were filled, Vincent waited for the last arrival to settle, and then he reached into his jacket pocket and placed one of the backup drives on the table in front of him. The room looked at it. "Before we discuss what Edward called this meeting to discuss," Vincent said, in the voice he used when the decision was already made, and the only remaining question was whether the room would align with it or against it. "I have something I'd like to show you. It's going to take about 20 minutes, and it's going to change what this meeting is actually about." Edward's hand moved on the table, just slightly. A small, controlled movement, the kind a person makes when they're stopping themselves from reaching for something. Vincent saw it. He put the drive into the laptop Dom had and turned the screen so the room could see, and thought, "Do it right," and began. The first file was the audio recording. Vincent didn't introduce it. He didn't explain what they were about to hear or who was speaking or how it had been obtained. He simply pressed play and let the room do what rooms do when something real enters them. Go very, very quiet. Edward's voice came through the laptop speakers at a volume calibrated for a medium-sized room, which this was. The conversation was the third audio file from Charlotte's drive. The cleanest recording, the one where the words were most distinct, where the operational language was least ambiguous. 22 seconds of it before Vincent paused it. He looked at the room. 8 of the 11 other men were looking at the laptop. 1 was looking at the table. 2 were looking at Edward. Edward was looking at Vincent. His expression had not collapsed. Vincent had half expected it to, had expected the confrontation of evidence to produce some visible fracture, the way direct accusation sometimes breaks through a performance that has been sustained too long. It didn't. Edward's face had settled into something careful and still, a deliberate blankness that was its own kind of tell, not the openness of someone who has nothing to hide, but the controlled surface of someone who has been preparing for exactly this and has decided on composed denial as the strategy. "Before anyone asks," Edward said, into the silence, with the measured precision of a man who has been in difficult rooms before and knows how to take up space in them, "I want to say that what you just heard requires significant context that—" "We'll hear the context," Vincent said, "after the evidence." "Vincent, after." Edward pressed his lips together. He picked up his water glass and set it down again without drinking. That was the first uncontrolled movement Vincent had seen from him, and he logged it the way he logged everything useful. Quietly, without reaction. He opened the second file. This one was video, the restaurant footage, the grainy overhead angle, Swanson and Edward at the table with the documents between them. He let it run for its full 38 seconds. Then he opened the financial map that Rains had printed and photographed, spreading the image across the laptop screen, and he talked through it for 11 minutes. He kept his voice flat and factual. He did not editorialize. He presented the account movements, the shell entity structure, the acquisition trajectory of the 6 businesses, the timeline as Charlotte had reconstructed it. He used Charlotte's documentation as the framework and chose testimony as the supporting detail, attributing both without theatrics. When he finished, he closed the laptop. The room had the specific quality of air after something loud has stopped, the absence of sound so complete it had a physical texture. Tony Graziano, who ran the West Side operations and had been with the family for 19 years, spoke first. He was not a man who spoke carelessly, and he did not do so now. "How long have you had this?" "Since this morning," Vincent said. "And Charlotte compiled it over 14 months. Alone." Another silence. Graziano looked at his hands on the table, then back up. "And Edward?" It wasn't a question. It was a designation. The moment of public naming. The shift from a situation involving evidence to a situation involving a person sitting in the room. "I'd like to hear the context now," Vincent said to Edward. Edward looked at him across the length of the table with the specific expression of a man who has just watched a door close and is calculating whether the window is still open. "This is incomplete," Edward said. His voice was still controlled. "What you've presented is a partial picture assembled by a woman who—" "Say the next word carefully," Vincent said. The room felt the temperature drop. Several men shifted in their chairs. Edward recalibrated. "Assembled by someone who was working without full understanding of the organizational context. Some of what you've described is legitimate financial restructuring that I undertook with your father's knowledge before his death. Restructuring that was never formally documented because your father preferred certain operations to exist outside the paper record." He paused to let that land. "I can explain every account movement if given access to the original. The original records for 3 of those accounts were deleted 14 months ago," Vincent said. Charlotte documented the deletion. The metadata shows the access credentials used. They belong to the same server account that pulled our security footage this morning. He held eye contact. "Your account, Edward." The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. Heavier. The kind that accumulates when a room collectively decides something. Edward's jaw moved. He was still thinking. Vincent could see it, the rapid internal calculation of someone who has just watched their primary strategy become untenable and is pivoting to the secondary. He'd spent a lifetime watching men calculate, and Edward Callahan had always been among the most sophisticated calculators he'd known. He watched him arrive at the secondary strategy in real time. "All right," Edward said, quietly, almost gently. The shift in his voice made 3 men look up. "Some of what you've described is accurate," Edward continued. "Some of the financial structures exist as you've described them. What isn't accurate is the framing." He turned slightly in his chair, addressing not just Vincent, but the room, expanding his audience, a practiced move. "Vincent, your father came to me in 2016, 2 years before he died. He was concerned about the organization's long-term exposure, about the federal climate, about the sustainability of the existing structure into the next generation." He paused. "He asked me to begin building an exit infrastructure, a way for the family to transition, over time, into legitimate operations, quietly, without triggering the kind of attention that an announced transition would attract." The room was absolutely still. "He asked you to build a shadow empire on the family's money," Graziano said slowly. "Not quite a question. He asked me to build a future," Edward said. "A legal future, for all of you." Vincent looked at him for a long moment. He thought about his father, who had been a complicated man, violent in specific and calculated ways, capable of sentiment in moments that surprised people, not given to long-term planning except when he was. He thought about whether this particular version of events was possible, whether his father could have set this in motion without telling him. He thought about Charlotte's letter. The last line, "Don't rush it, do it right." "Did he document it?" Vincent asked. "Your father documented almost nothing. Did he tell anyone else?" "He was careful." "Did he tell Marco?" Marco Vitelli, sitting 4 chairs down from Vincent on the left side, had not spoken since the meeting started. He was looking at Edward with an expression that had been settling into its current form slowly, the way a face settles when it recognizes something it wishes it hadn't. "He didn't tell Marco," Vincent said. "Not a question." "Vincent," Edward started. "Marco." Vincent looked at him. "Did my father ever mention a transition plan? A restructuring project? Anything that matches what Edward is describing?" Marco was quiet for 2 seconds. In the 23 years Vincent had known him, he had never seen Marco take 2 full seconds to answer a direct question. The pause was an answer in itself. "No," Marco said. The word landed in the room like a physical object. Edward's composure shifted. Not broke. Shifted. A hairline adjustment in the set of his mouth, a slight intensification around the eyes. He was still calculating. I was going to keep calculating until something physically stopped him, because that was the nature of the man. The same quality that had built 6 years of parallel financial architecture. The refusal to stop working a problem even when the conditions had fundamentally changed. Marco was kept out of it specifically, Edward said, because your father didn't trust. Marco's hand came down flat on the table. Not a slam. A placement. Deliberate. Definitive. The sound of someone ending a sentence that hadn't been finished yet. Don't, Marco said. His voice was very quiet and completely final. Don't say what you were going to say. Edward looked at him, looked back at Vincent. In that moment, the 3 or 4 seconds of Edward looking from Marco to Vincent and back. Vincent saw him make the final calculation. Saw him arrive at the place where all the exits had closed and only one response was left, which was the response of a man who has been cornered and knows it, and decides that the remaining question is not whether to concede, but how to exit with maximum damage done. Edward stood up. The federal investigation into the Moretti Syndicate's financial operations, he said, to the room, to all of it, with the calm of someone detonating something they've been holding for years, has been running for 8 months. It was opened based on a referral from an anonymous source who provided account records and organizational charts to the Chicago field office. He paused. I know this because I am the one who provided them. The room erupted, not in shouting, in the specific kind of controlled chaos that experienced men produce when something catastrophic enters a space they operate in, the overlapping sounds of chairs moving and voices cutting across each other, and the particular silence that several individuals produced by going completely still while the noise happened around them. Vincent did not move. He sat at the head of the table and watched Edward stand at the other end and let the information expand into the room and do whatever it was going to do, and he kept his face absolutely neutral because the worst thing he could do in this moment was show Edward that it had worked, that the detonation had connected, that the floor had shifted under him. It had. He could feel it. The cold, specific sensation of ground that was no longer solid. The understanding that Edward had been running 2 simultaneous plays the entire time. Not just the financial architecture and the parallel empire. Also this. A federal arrangement, a relationship with investigators, a contingency that transformed his exposure from a criminal one into something more complicated, more protected, more difficult to address through the means that the Moretti Syndicate ordinarily used to address threats. You couldn't disappear someone who had an active cooperation arrangement with the federal government. You couldn't make the evidence go away if he was the one who had already provided the primary evidence to the investigators building the case. He's protected, Dom said quietly, from his position near the door. He was saying it to Vincent, not to the room. The assessment of a man who understood operational realities. Vincent understood. Edward had built himself a shield using the same organization he'd been dismantling. If anything happened to him now, the cooperation arrangement would collapse in a way that brought federal attention down on everyone in this room with the full weight of 8 months of accumulated investigation. He had made himself too expensive to touch. Everyone out, Vincent said. The room looked at him. Out? Now. Wait in the hall. Dom. He looked at Dom. Stay. The room cleared in 90 seconds. Men filed out with the focused quiet of people who have received a credible instruction in a credible tone and understand that this is not the moment for questions. The door closed. Vincent, Dom, and Edward were the only ones left. Edward remained standing. He had his hands at his sides, and his posture was the posture of someone who has delivered a prepared statement and is now waiting for the next phase. Sit down, Vincent said. I'd rather... Sit down, Edward. He sat. Vincent looked at him across the length of the table. He thought about the 30 years. He thought about the advice, the steadiness, the times he'd sat in this man's office and been talked through decisions he couldn't think through alone. He thought about the funeral for his father, where Edward had stood at his left shoulder and said nothing, just been there, which had been exactly right. He thought about Charlotte in the kitchen with financial documents spread in front of her at 11 at night. The federal arrangement, Vincent said. What are the terms? Immunity for myself and a limited cooperation framework for the family's lower-tier operations in exchange for full disclosure of the syndicate's financial structure and testimony regarding 3 specific operations from the past 6 years. Testimony, Dom said. The word came out with a particular flatness. Testimony, Edward confirmed. He looked at Dom without apology. I am 67 years old. I built this organization from a collection of street-level operations into something that generates $300 million a year in legitimate revenue. I spent 30 years doing it, and I will not spend the years I have left in a federal institution." He looked back at Vincent. "Your father understood that. He built his own arrangement before he died, which is something you were never told because there are things about your father that were considered—" "Stop," Vincent said. Edward stopped. "You're going to tell me my father had a federal arrangement," Vincent said, "and I'm going to sit here and not be able to immediately disprove it because my father is dead, and you've had 30 years to construct whatever narrative you need." He leaned forward, his forearms on the table. "So let me tell you what I know. What I can prove. What Charlotte proved." He reached into his jacket and put both backup drives on the table. "Charlotte's contingency," he said. "She has a federal contact independent of yours. Her contact has been receiving incremental uploads of this evidence for the past 6 weeks on a delayed transmission schedule. In approximately 72 hours, the final package, including the audio recordings, the financial maps, the account documentation, and the complete record of the shell entity acquisition, transmits automatically unless she personally cancels it." He watched Edward's face. The shift was small, but it was there. The recalculation happening behind the composed surface, the reorientation of a man who has just discovered that the thing he thought was his leverage is actually the mechanism of his exposure. "Your cooperation arrangement is with federal investigators who have been building a case based on your disclosures," Vincent continued. "Charlotte's package goes to those same investigators, or to parallel investigators, with the complete financial map, including the 6 years of capital extraction from this organization, which you did not disclose, which is a separate set of crimes from the ones you're cooperating on, which means your immunity arrangement doesn't cover them." The room was so quiet that Vincent could hear Edward's breathing change, not dramatically, just a slight deepening, the body's involuntary response to the understanding that the room has just changed shape around it. "You didn't tell them about the extraction," Dom said, slowly, working it out. "You gave them operational information, structure, personnel, specific transactions, but you didn't tell them about the money you were taking out. Because if you disclose that, you'd lose the parallel empire you were building with it." Edward said nothing. "You gave them enough to build a case against the syndicate," Vincent said, "while protecting the one thing you needed protected, the exit, the 6 businesses, the clean life you were constructing on the back of everything you helped build." He paused. "And Charlotte found it. The part you didn't disclose. The part that sits outside your immunity agreement and directly contradicts your cooperation narrative." He straightened. "So here's where we are, Edward. You have a federal arrangement that doesn't cover your actual crimes. Charlotte has an independent contingency that will surface those crimes in 72 hours, regardless of what happens in this room. And you are sitting across from me in a building that I own." He let that last sentence stand alone for a moment. "What do you want?" Edward said. His voice was still controlled, but it was controlled the way a rope is taut, not by strength, but by the full weight of what was hanging from it. "I want the full financial record," Vincent said. "Every account, every shell entity, every acquisition. Complete documentation of the parallel structure, disclosed to Charlotte's federal contact and not to yours. Which means your existing cooperation arrangement becomes complicated by the introduction of evidence your handlers don't have, and that contradicts the picture you've given them. That destroys my immunity." "Yes." "That puts me at serious legal exposure." "Yes." Edward looked at him for a long moment. "And if I refuse?" "Then we wait 72 hours and the package transmits, and the investigators who receive it start asking why your cooperation disclosures didn't include any of this. And the answer to that question is worse for you than the question itself." Vincent kept his voice completely level. "You built something careful, Edward. 6 years of careful. But you couldn't plan for Charlotte because you didn't take her seriously, and that's the only mistake you made, and it was enough." The silence stretched. Dom shifted his weight by the door. Outside in the hallway, Vincent could hear the muffled presence of the 11 men waiting. Edward's hands, both of them, were flat on the table. He was looking at the space between them. Not at Vincent, not at Dom, at the table surface, at the particular nothing that a man looks at when he is performing the final calculation of a life's work and arriving at the number he didn't want. "The recording," Edward said. "The one your wife made. The 3rd audio file. What about it?" "There are things in that recording that aren't part of my arrangement with the federal investigators." He looked up. His eyes were tired in a way that his face had been concealing until this moment, the tiredness of a 67-year-old man who has been running on the sustained tension of a 6-year deception and has just felt the tension release all at once. Things that would be useful to your organization's stability if they remain outside the federal disclosure. Vincent waited. There is a second cooperation arrangement, Edward said. Not mine. Someone else's. Someone who is not in this building and whose name is not in Charlotte's files because she didn't know to look for them. He paused. Someone who has been providing operational intelligence to a separate federal task force for approximately 2 years. Someone close enough to your daily operations that the information they've been providing is considerably more damaging than anything I disclosed. The cold came back. The floor-shifting cold of structural information that changes the shape of everything above it. Name, Vincent said. That's what I'm trading, Edward said. The full financial record, the disclosures, the parallel structure, for the name. And a 10-minute head start. You're not getting a head start, Dom said from the door. His voice had an edge in it that he wasn't fully controlling. Dom, Vincent said. Dom went quiet. Vincent looked at Edward. He thought about Charlotte's letter, do it right. He thought about the photograph of her hand, the wrist scar, the message. Don't do anything she wouldn't do. I thought about what Charlotte would do with a trade like this. A trade that gave her something real and verifiable in exchange for a mercy that cost her something, but not everything. The financial record first, Vincent said. Complete. Verified by Rains before we discuss anything else. Then the name. Then we discuss the head start. I need the head start agreed before. You need whatever I decide to give you, Vincent said. And right now, the thing working in your favor is that I am choosing to do this the way my wife would do it instead of the way I would do it. So take what's on the table, Edward, and give me the record. Edward looked at him for a long time. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and removed a phone. Not his regular phone, a secondary device, the kind you carry when you need a second identity, and placed it on the table and slid it toward Vincent. Everything is on there, he said. Encrypted. The key is 11 digits. Your father's date of birth reversed. He paused on that. He did know Vincent, not everything, but he knew something was being built. He chose not to ask the details. That was his choice and his failure, not mine to carry. He stood up. The second name is Paulie Ferrante. The name arrived in the room and did what names do in rooms like this when they carry the weight of betrayal behind them. Paulie Ferrante was 38 years old. He ran the Moretti Syndicate's East Side distribution network. He had been with the family for 12 years. He had been at Vincent's wedding. He sent flowers when Charlotte's mother had been ill 2 years ago. He had been, by every available measure, exactly what he appeared to be. Loyal, present, dependable. Dom made a sound, not a word. Just a sound. The involuntary response of a man who has just heard a name he trusted attached to a fact he cannot reconcile with 12 years of shared work. How long? Vincent said. 2 years, Edward said. He came to the arrangement independently of mine. I found out 14 months ago. And you didn't tell me. I kept it in reserve. No apology in his voice, just the flat honesty of a man who has decided that the performance is over and the only currency left is the truth. I knew I might need it. Vincent stood up. Edward stood also by reflex, the way men do when the person at the head of the table rises. Dom is going to take your phone to Rains, Vincent said. You're going to stay in this room until she verifies the record is complete. After that, he stopped, looked at Edward, at the man who had sat at his right hand for 9 years and his father's right hand for 20 before that, at the face that had been present for every significant moment of his adult life in this organization, every crisis navigated, every decision made. He thought about what it cost to build 30 years of something and then dismantle it from the inside for the last 6. He thought about what it cost to watch it happen. After that, he said, you'll have until morning. It wasn't a gift, it was a line. The precise line between what Charlotte would do and what he would do, the narrowest possible version of the mercy she'd asked him to maintain. He walked out of the room. In the hallway, 11 men stood waiting. Some were looking at him, some were looking at the floor. He moved through them toward the elevator without speaking, and Dom fell into step beside him, and as the elevator doors opened, Vincent pulled out his phone and called the number of the unknown contact, the one from this morning, the one that had sent him the photograph of Charlotte's hand. It rang twice. It's done, Vincent said. I need Charlotte's federal contact. Whatever she set up, the contingency, the automatic transmission, I need it paused. I have the financial record, and I have a second name, and I need to bring both to the right people before the 72-hour window closes. A silence on the other end. Then, she said you'd call. She said to tell you the contact's name is Agent Diana Marsh, Chicago Field Office, and that she'll be expecting you. When? She said whenever you were ready. A pause. She also said to tell you that she knew you'd do it right. The elevator opened on the lobby. Vincent walked through it with Dom beside him, and the cold phone in his hand and the weight of 2 drives in his pocket, and Polly Ferrante's name running through his head like a current through a wire. And outside through the glass doors, the Chicago night was wet and black and continuous, and he pushed through the doors into it without breaking stride. Across the city, in a room he didn't know yet, Charlotte was waiting. But first there was Polly Ferrante, who was at this moment sitting in a bar on the east side with no idea that his name had been spoken in a room on the 14th floor of a building he'd been in 100 times, and who had 2 years of federal disclosures sitting behind him, and 12 years of performed loyalty and the specific vulnerability of a man who believes his arrangement is secret and has never seriously considered the possibility that the man who built it decided to trade it. Dom looked at him as they hit the sidewalk, rain on his face, immediate and cold. Polly, Dom said. The word came out rough. I know. How do you want to... Not here. Vincent kept moving. Call Graziano. Tell him I need Polly at the East Side warehouse in 40 minutes. Use a reason he won't question. And when he gets there... Vincent stopped walking. He stood on the wet sidewalk with the rain coming down and the lights of the city smearing themselves across every surface, and he thought about Charlotte walking through the pedestrian gate at 9:02 p.m. with 1 bag and her reading glasses and 14 months of work in an envelope hidden behind a row of legal codes. And he thought about what she'd built and what it had cost her and what it had been for. When he gets there, Vincent said, I'm going to give him the same choice I gave Edward. The evidence first, then the options. He paused. And then whatever he decides. And if he doesn't decide the right way, then we stop doing it her way, Vincent said, and started walking again, and Dom kept pace, and the rain kept coming down on both of them equally, indifferent to what either of them were carrying, and the city moved around them the way cities move around the things that happen inside them, without acknowledgement, without pause, without the slightest indication that anything had changed. But everything had changed. The warehouse on the east side had a loading bay on the south face that Vincent had used for meetings before, utilitarian, unrecorded, the kind of space where conversations happened that didn't need witnesses. He arrived before Polly, which was intentional. He stood in the middle of the empty floor under fluorescent lights that buzzed at a frequency just below audible and waited with Dom to his left, and Graziano, who had been told enough to understand the gravity without being told the specifics, positioned near the bay door. Polly Ferrante arrived at 9 minutes past the time Graziano had given him. He came in through the side entrance with his jacket collar up against the rain, moving with the particular ease of a man who has no idea what room he's walking into, and he stopped when he saw Vincent standing in the center of the floor rather than the 2 mid-level operators he'd been told to expect. The ease went out of his posture, not dramatically, a slight adjustment, the weight shifting, the shoulders dropping a fraction. Enough. Vincent! He said it with the tone of someone extending a greeting while simultaneously assessing an unfamiliar situation. Graziano said there was a distribution issue. There isn't, Vincent said. Sit down. There was a metal folding chair 10 feet in front of Vincent. Polly looked at it. He looked at Dom. He looked at Graziano by the door. He sat down. Vincent looked at him for a moment. 12 years. He thought about the flowers for Charlotte's mother. He thought about what it meant to send flowers to someone's mother while simultaneously feeding operational intelligence about her husband to a federal task force. He reached into his jacket. Polly's body tensed. Vincent put a single sheet of paper on the floor between them. A printed summary, 1 page, the kind Rains could produce in 4 minutes when given a directive. He stepped back. Read it, he said. Polly looked at the paper. He didn't move for a moment. Then he leaned forward and picked it up and read it. And Vincent watched his face and saw the moment, the precise second, about 2/3 down the page, where the performance ended. It didn't collapse. It just stopped. Like a machine that has been running continuously and has finally been switched off. The absence of motion where motion had been, the stillness of something that is no longer pretending. Polly set the paper down on the floor in front of his feet. How? He said. Not a complete question, just the beginning of one. Does it matter? Vincent said. Polly looked up at him. His eyes had the quality of a man who has been caught not in a moment, but in a years-long decision, and who is now doing the arithmetic of what that means for everything that comes after. No, Polly said. I guess it doesn't. 2 years, Vincent said. Yes. Operational intelligence. Yes. Personnel movements. Transaction timing. Security protocols. Each yes came out of Polly with the flatness of a man who has stopped calculating and arrived at something underneath the calculation. Not quite remorse, not quite relief, but the specific weight of a thing that has been carried a long time and has just been set down. Why? Vincent said. Polly looked at the floor between his feet. He looked at his hands. He looked up. My brother, he said. Federal exposure from 4 years ago. They had him on distribution charges, 10 to 15, minimum. They said they'd make it go away if I... He stopped, started again. I didn't think it would be 2 years. I thought it would be one conversation and then it would be done. It's never one conversation, Graziano said from the door. His voice was flat and old. No, Polly said. It wasn't. Vincent stood looking at him for a long moment. He thought about what Charlotte would see if she were standing here. He thought about what she would do with a man who had spent 2 years betraying someone he genuinely liked, under compulsion, for a reason that was not entirely without humanity, in a situation he had clearly not fully understood when he entered it. He thought about the word right, what it required. Your brother's name, Vincent said. Polly looked up. His name, his case, his attorney, everything. Vincent held his eyes. You're going to give it all to me, and I'm going to have someone look at the exposure and find whatever legitimate avenue exists to address it. That's not a promise, Polly. I'm telling you I'll look at it. He paused. In exchange, you're going to your federal handler tomorrow morning and you're going to tell them the arrangement is over. That you're done. That whatever they have, but you won't be providing anything further. And then you're going to call me from that meeting. Polly stared at him. You're not... He stopped. His voice had a quality in it that Vincent hadn't expected and didn't particularly want to examine because it was the sound of a man arriving at something he hadn't allowed himself to feel for 2 years. You're not going to... I'm doing it right, Vincent said. Don't make me explain that twice. Outside, the rain was still falling, and somewhere on the other side of the city, Agent Diana Marsh was sitting with a phone that hadn't rung yet, and Charlotte was in a room that Vincent didn't know, and the 72-hour window was running, and everything that had started with a phone call at 8:14 p.m. And a wedding ring placed against a candlestick was moving toward the moment when it would either resolve or it wouldn't. Vincent put his jacket back on. We're done here, he said to the room, to Polly, to Dom, to Graziano, to the buzzing fluorescent lights, and the wet concrete floor and the 12 years of something that had just been permanently altered. He walked toward the bay door. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He stopped. Pulled it out. The text was from the unknown number. 1 line. She's ready to come home, but you need to get to her before Marsh does, because Edward made one more call before Dom's people got to him, and whoever he called knows where she is. Vincent read it twice. His pulse, which had been steady through the meeting, through Edward, through Polly, through all of it, shifted. Not much, but enough to feel. He looked at Dom. Dom had read it over his shoulder. Location, Vincent said. Right now. Whatever Charlotte's contact can give us. Dom already had his phone out. And the city kept moving around them, indifferent as always, and the rain kept falling, and somewhere in it Charlotte was waiting in a room she thought was safe. And the window between safe and not safe was closing at a speed that had nothing to do with how carefully either of them had Dom got the location at 11:23 p.m. It came through Charlotte's federal contact. Agent Marsh had been reached, had listened to 17 seconds of Vincent's explanation, and had said with the flat efficiency of someone who processes urgent information for a living, I know where she is. I helped her set it up. If Edward made a call, we have maybe 30 minutes before whoever he called confirms the location. She gave Dom an address on the north side, near the lakefront, a residential building 2 blocks from a public library that Charlotte had apparently selected because it had 2 stairwells, a doorman who rotated shifts at midnight, and a back exit onto a street with consistent foot traffic, even at this hour. Vincent was in the car before Dom finished relaying the address. They ran 3 red lights getting there. Dom didn't comment on it. The 2 cars behind them kept pace without being asked. Vincent sat in the front passenger seat with his phone in his hand and the unknown contact's last message on the screen. Whoever he called knows where she is, and he thought about the 30-minute window the way you think about something you cannot afford to calculate because the calculation produces answers you can't use. He thought about Edward making a call before Dom's people reached him. He thought about what that call was, who received it, what the instruction was. I didn't know Edward's full network. He'd spent 9 years assuming that Edward's full network was the Moretti network, which was his network, which was something he controlled. He understood now that this had been exactly the assumption Edward had counted on. The building was a 6-story brick structure with a small lobby visible through glass doors. The doorman was at his desk, young, inattentive, the kind of presence that discourages casual entry without actually preventing determined entry. A light was on in a window on the 4th floor, the second from the left, and Vincent noted it without deciding whether it meant anything. Dom stopped the car half a block short. "How do you want to do this?" "Fast," Vincent said. "Me and you. The others stay on the street and watch the back exit. If someone's already inside, then we deal with it inside." He was already opening the door. Dom caught his arm. "Not hard. Just enough." "Vincent, she built this to keep herself safe. She thought it through. She's not going to be standing in the middle of the room." "I know. I'm just saying, don't go in there like the building's on fire." Vincent looked at him for a moment. He thought about the way Dom had said, "I'm just saying." The particular tone of a man who has been beside you for 9 years and has earned the right to say the thing you need to hear in the way you can actually receive it. "Noted," he said. He got out of the car. The doorman looked up as they came through the glass doors and started to say something professional, and Vincent put a folded bill on the desk without breaking stride and said, "4th floor," in a tone that ended the conversation before it started. Dom was already at the elevator. They rode up in silence. The elevator was old, the kind that moved with a slight shudder and made a sound at each floor like it was registering something. Vincent watched the numbers. He kept his breathing even, which took effort because his body wanted to do something other than breathe evenly. Wanted to respond to the adrenaline the way it had been trained to respond over 20 years of situations that required fast and physical responses. Wanted to convert the tension into action, rather than into the restrained, controlled forward motion that Charlotte's approach to everything demanded. He kept it even. The 4th floor hallway was carpeted and quiet. 6 doors on each side. He counted from the left, second door, which would correspond to the window with the light. He knocked. 3 times, then a pause, then once more. Not a prearranged signal, just the pattern that felt less threatening than a loud, sustained knock at 11:30 at night. Silence. Then, "Who is it?" Her voice. He felt something in his chest unhook. A tension he'd been holding for so long it had started to feel structural, like something load-bearing, and its release left him momentarily uncertain of his own weight. "It's me," he said. A pause. Longer than he expected. He understood the pause. She was thinking, not hesitating. She was assessing whether this was real, whether the voice was real, whether the situation outside the door matched the situation she'd planned for. "Are you alone?" she said. "Dom's with me." Another pause. Then the sound of a chain being released, a deadbolt turning, a second lock. She'd brought her own, he would find out later, a portable door lock she'd purchased specifically for this room, being removed. The door opened. She was wearing dark slacks and a gray sweater he'd seen before, one that she'd bought at a shop in Michigan and that she wore when she was working at home on difficult things because she'd told him once that it felt like armor without looking like it. Her hair was down. She looked like she hadn't slept in 2 days, which she hadn't. Her eyes, when they found his, were doing the thing they did when she was processing multiple things simultaneously. That slight intensity behind the surface calm. The look of a woman whose mind was running faster than her expression showed. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. "Edward made a call," he said. "We have a window." "I know," she said. "Marsh texted me 12 minutes ago." She stepped back. "Come in." The room was small and functional. A studio apartment used for short-term rental, the furniture generic and impersonal. She'd set up a workspace at the small table by the window. Her laptop, 2 notebooks, a phone that wasn't her regular one, a cup of cold tea she hadn't finished. The backup copy of the evidence files was on a drive beside the laptop. She'd been working when they knocked. He looked at the open notebook and saw her handwriting, small, dense, the same handwriting from the letter. and looked away from it because looking at it too long made the thing in his chest do something he didn't have time for right now. "Who did he call?" Charlotte said. "We don't know yet. Someone with access to your location." "Then we have less than 30 minutes. She was already closing the laptop, moving with the efficient economy of someone who has a departure sequence and is executing it. "The contingency transmission, I need to log in and extend the window." The original 72 hours accounts for normal delays. But if we're taking this directly to Marsh tonight, I need to adjust the parameters so it doesn't transmit before we're ready to coordinate with her. Can you do that from here? Yes. She opened the laptop again, did something he didn't follow in the specific details, clicked twice, and closed it again. Done. Extended by 48 hours. That gives us a real window. He watched her move. The efficiency of it, the preparation behind it. The quality of someone who had thought through every contingency and had a response ready for each. He thought about Peter Cho's voice. She's careful. She was careful about everyone. She picked up the drive and the 2 notebooks and put them in the bag that was already packed and sitting by the door. He noticed it had been by the door ready since before he arrived. She'd been ready to move before he'd knocked. "Charlotte," he said. She looked up. "I found Peter Cho," he said. "He called me this morning. He's safe. He's at the mansion." Something moved through her face. Relief, real and unguarded. The first completely unguarded expression he'd seen from her in this room. "He's all right." "He's all right." She exhaled through her nose, nodded once. Then she picked up her bag and looked at him and said, "Then let's go." They went down the back stairwell, Dom leading, Charlotte in the middle, Vincent behind. 2 flights down, they heard the front door of the building open. Not the elevator. The stairwell door at the ground level, the sound of it opening from the lobby side, and then footsteps on the stairs. Coming up. Moving with the particular rhythm of people who are moving efficiently because they know where they're going and how long they have. Dom stopped. Vincent put his hand on Charlotte's shoulder, not pushing, just present, and she stopped too. 3 of them on the landing between the 3rd and 2nd floor. The footsteps below still coming. Dom looked back at Vincent. A question without words. Vincent counted the footsteps. 2 sets. Moving in sync the way people move when they've worked together before. He looked at the stairwell door on the 3rd floor landing. 2 feet away, accessible. He made the calculation in approximately 1 second. "3rd floor," he said quietly. "Now." They went through the door. Dom moved to the right, Charlotte to the left. Vincent pulled the door closed behind them and kept his hand on the handle, feeling the vibration of the door settle. Through the gap at the bottom, he could see the light in the stairwell shifting as the figures passed the 3rd floor landing without stopping. Continuing upward, toward the 4th. Toward the room Charlotte had just left. They stayed still in the 3rd floor hallway for 30 seconds. Vincent's hand on the door handle. Charlotte beside him, her bag strap in both hands, breathing controlled and steady. He could hear her breathing, not fast, not panicked, just present. Managed. The way she managed everything. Then the sound of a door being forced open, not violently, more like a shoulder check against a lock that yielded, and then voices, indistinct, and then nothing. "Backstairs," Dom said. They found the secondary stairwell at the far end of the 3rd floor hallway, a narrower one, the kind that exists in older buildings as a fire access route and is never used by anyone who knows about the main stairs. Single file down to a door that opened onto a side alley rather than the main street. Cold air. Wet pavement. The smell of rain on brick. Dom's people were at the back exit. He'd redirected them when they'd taken the stairwell, and they came around the corner of the alley in 2 cars without headlights until they were moving. Vincent put Charlotte in the rear of the first car and got in beside her. Dom took the front. They pulled out of the alley and into the street. Charlotte sat beside him with her bag on her lap and looked at the city moving past the window. He looked at her profile. She was looking at the street but not really seeing it. The focus turned inward. The processing that he'd learned meant she was running through something, checking a sequence, verifying something against itself. "The 4th floor," she said. Not to him specifically. To the air. "They know what they'll find." "Which is nothing." She turned from the window and looked at him. For the first time since he'd come through the door, the efficiency dropped slightly. Not all the way. Not into something soft or broken, just into something more honest about its own weight. "Are you all right?" He almost said yes. It was the automatic answer, the one that had served him for 20 years of situations where the honest answer was more complicated and less useful. "No," he said. "Not entirely." She looked at him. "Okay," she said, which was not the same okay as the one she'd said in the kitchen when he'd left the night of their anniversary. It was the other kind, the one that means I hear you rather than I'll absorb this and say nothing. He looked at her hand on the bag strap. He wanted to cover it with his own. He didn't yet. There was still too much between now and the place where that gesture could land correctly. "Marsh," he said, "we need to meet her tonight." "I know where." She pulled out the secondary phone and made a call that lasted 40 seconds and gave an address he didn't recognize. They met Agent Diana Marsh at 12:40 a.m. in the back room of a restaurant that had closed 3 hours earlier and whose owner, Charlotte explained without elaborating, owed her a favor from a situation 2 years ago that Vincent had never been told about and which was apparently not the moment to explain. Marsh was 53, had the build and posture of someone who spent a decade doing fieldwork before moving into investigative roles, and had the eyes of a person who has heard enough versions of enough stories to have very little left to surprise her. She shook Vincent's hand with the neutral assessment of someone who has been briefed on him professionally and is now calibrating that briefing against the actual person. She looked at Charlotte with something that wasn't quite warmth, but was in the neighborhood of it. The expression of a professional relationship that has accumulated enough mutual respect to constitute something real, even if it doesn't have a comfortable name. "Mrs. Moretti," she said. "Diana," Charlotte said. They sat at a table in the back of the empty restaurant with the lights at half and the evidence drives on the table between them, and for the next hour and 40 minutes, Charlotte walked Marsh through everything: the account structures, the shell entities, the 6 businesses, the audio recordings, the video footage, the financial maps, Paulie Ferrante's arrangement and his federal handler, Edward Callahan's cooperation agreement, and the material he'd withheld from it. Vincent sat beside Charlotte and contributed when she indicated he should, and otherwise listened, and he found that listening was the correct thing to do because Charlotte's command of the material was absolute. She knew every account number, every transmission date, every shell entity's registered jurisdiction, every link in the chain she'd built over 14 months by herself, at a kitchen table, in a library desk, and probably in the car, and in the margins of other things, in the small hours, while the life they shared continued around her. When she finished, Marsh was quiet for a moment. "The parallel cooperation structure complicates Edward's existing arrangement," Marsh said. "But the financial extraction crimes fall outside his immunity agreement's scope, which means his testimony doesn't protect him from the charges that arise from Charlotte's material." "That's what we understood," Vincent said. "Paulie Ferrante's handler is in the Detroit field office," Marsh said. "Not mine. The interagency friction is going to be—" She stopped, looked at Charlotte. "Your material is cleaner than anything Ferrante's provided. The Detroit office is going to have to reconcile 18 months of operational intelligence from a compromised source against the financial documentation you've built." She paused. "That's going to be an uncomfortable conversation for several people in my agency." "I know," Charlotte said. "You planned for it." "I planned for it." Marsh looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd used when Charlotte came in. Not quite warmth, but the neighboring thing. "The contingency transmission. You've extended the window. 48 hours from tonight. That's enough to file the initial preservation order." She looked at Vincent. "What I need from you is voluntary cooperation with the financial disclosure process. Not testimony. Not yet. But cooperation, which means your organization doesn't move any assets while we process this." "Agreed," Vincent said. "That's not a small agreement." "I know what it is." Marsh looked at him for another moment with the neutral professional assessment. Then she picked up the drives and the printed documentation and stood up. "I'm going to need 6 hours," she said. "After 6 hours, I'll have enough filed to make this material part of a protected record." She looked at Charlotte. "You did good work." "I did necessary work," Charlotte said. Marsh left. The restaurant was empty and quiet. The owner's staff had departed before Marsh arrived. Charlotte and Vincent sat at the table in the half-light with the cold remnants of coffee. Neither of them had drunk, and the residue of an hour and 40 minutes of precise, necessary conversation, settling around them, like something that had been held up for a long time and had finally been set down. Dom was outside. The others were outside. Inside, it was just the two of them for the first time since the night of their anniversary, and the space between them on the table had none of the careful silverware and real candles of that night. Just two empty cups and a cleared surface, and the weight of everything that had happened between that kitchen doorway and this table. Charlotte wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, even though it was empty. He watched her do it, the particular gesture of someone who needs to hold something. He said, 8 months ago. She looked up. You left documents on my desk, financial summaries, and I didn't read them. She held his eyes. No. I told you I'd glanced at them. Yes, I hadn't. I know. He sat with that. The weight of it was a specific weight, not guilt alone, which would have been simpler, but the combination of guilt and something more structural, the understanding of a pattern that had been running for longer than he wanted to name, a pattern of assuming that because Charlotte didn't demand attention, she didn't require it, of letting her excellence make her invisible, of treating her patience as a feature of the environment rather than as a choice she was making every day that could have been made differently. How long? He said. Before the documents, before you started. How long did you know something was wrong? I noticed the first anomaly 22 months ago, she said, when I was reviewing the charitable trust documents. 22 months. He'd been married to her for 14 months before she disappeared. That meant she'd been carrying the beginning of this before they were even married. She'd walked down whatever aisle they'd used. The civil ceremony in the judge's chamber, Charlotte's family present, Marco at Vincent's shoulder. Already holding something she hadn't told him about because she wasn't sure enough yet to bring it, because Charlotte didn't bring things until she was sure. Why didn't you tell me when you were sure? He said. She was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, thinking. The way she always thought before answering the real question behind the asked question. Because I was afraid, she said. Not of Edward. I was afraid that if I came to you with something that implicated someone you'd trusted for 30 years and I was wrong, or the evidence wasn't enough, or you heard it the wrong way, that you would choose his 30 years over my 14 months. She paused. And I was afraid that if you did, there wouldn't be a version of this marriage I could continue being inside of. The honesty of it landed in the room fully and without softening. He'd asked for the real answer, and she'd given it to him, which was what she always did when he asked correctly, which was something he hadn't always done. Would I have, he said, chosen his 30 years? She looked at him for a long time. I don't know, she said. That's the honest answer. I didn't know, and I wasn't willing to find out the wrong way. She set the empty cup down. So I built something that made the choice unnecessary, something that was undeniable regardless of who was delivering it. You built it so I couldn't choose loyalty over evidence, he said. I built it so you wouldn't have to choose at all, so the evidence would do the choosing. He thought about that. He thought about what it said about her, the patience of it, the protection of it, the specific kindness of constructing something that took his worst possible failure mode out of the equation. She hadn't trusted the outcome, but she'd trusted him enough to do the work that would make the outcome survivable regardless. The night I left, he said. Olivia's call. I knew it might be a setup, she said. I didn't know who arranged it. I suspected it was connected to what I'd been building, someone trying to create distance between us at a specific moment. I didn't know how directly. You could have told me. I told you 8 months earlier, and you hadn't read the documents. The words were not accusatory. They were just accurate, in the way Charlotte's words were usually accurate. I needed you to find it yourself. I needed, not for pride, Vincent, for you. She looked at his face carefully. You needed to get there without me standing next to you telling you what to think. Because if I told you, you'd believe it because I said so. And in 6 months or 2 years, when Edward or someone like him needed you to doubt me, you'd have nothing but my word against theirs. She paused. But if you found it, if you followed the trail, made the connection, sat in that room and held the evidence up yourself, then it was yours. No one can take that from you. Not Edward. Not anyone. He looked at her. He thought about all the times in the last 24 hours he'd felt like he was following her. Her trail, her logic, her evidence, her standards, her instruction to do it right. He thought about whether being led was the same as being diminished, and arrived at the answer that it wasn't. That the difference was in what you did with the leading, whether you ran from it or ran toward it. The note, he said. 5 words. She almost smiled. Not quite. Something at the corner of her mouth. The specific expression that preceded a real smile in her when she was also too tired and too wrung out to complete it. I wrote 15 versions of it, she said. Kept deleting them because they were too long, too explanatory. Too much of me trying to make you feel better about something that wasn't supposed to feel better yet. She looked down at her hands. 5 words was what was left after I took out everything I was writing for myself. He reached into his jacket pocket. He'd been carrying it since the dining room, since the moment he picked it up from beside the candlestick and turned it over and read the engraving and set it back down and then picked it up again before he went upstairs and never put it down after that. He'd carried it through the search of the bedroom, the conversation with Dom, the session with Rains, the financial maps, Edward's meeting, Polly in the warehouse, the drive north through the rain. He set it on the table between them, her wedding ring. She looked at it. He watched her look at it, watched her face do something quiet and specific, the expression of a person looking at something they put down in a deliberate and costly moment, and are now encountering again on the other side of what that moment required. He didn't pick it up and try to put it on her finger. He didn't make a speech. He left it on the table between them and looked at her and waited, because she had built 14 months of patient, careful, precise work to arrive at this moment, and she was the one who should decide what the moment looked like. She reached out and picked it up. She turned it over once in her fingers, the way he'd turned it over in the dining room. She read the engraving, which she had chosen, V plus C, always forward, and she held it in her closed hand for a moment. Then she looked at him. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Okay." "I wasn't sure you'd find the box in the closet. I thought you might, but I wasn't sure." She held his eyes. "I had a second trail. If you hadn't found it in 48 hours, it was going to be triggered through Peter. He knew to reach out." "I know," Vincent said. "He told me." Something flickered in her expression. Surprise, which was rare enough from her that he noticed it every time. "He told you. He wanted me to know you'd thought of everything. I think he thought it would help." He paused. "It did." The almost smile came back. This time it made it all the way. It was tired and real and not particularly beautiful in the way photographs of people smiling are beautiful. It was the smile of someone who has been through something long and difficult and is sitting on the other side of it at 12:50 in the morning in an empty restaurant and has found, against some reasonable expectation, that the person across from them is still there. She slid the ring onto her own finger. He watched her do it. She placed it on the finger where it belonged, adjusted it slightly, looked at it once, and then looked at him. "Okay," she said. He let out a breath that had been compressed somewhere in his chest since he'd walked into the dining room and found the candles burned down. They sat there for a while, not talking. The half-light of the empty restaurant, the sounds of Dom's people outside, the occasional passing car on the street beyond the darkened windows, the small sounds of a city at 1 in the morning that doesn't stop being a city just because the humans inside it are exhausted. Vincent thought about what came next. There was a great deal that came next. Marcia's filing in 6 hours, the federal coordination, the preservation orders, the complicated unraveling of Edward's cooperation arrangement against the backdrop of Charlotte's material, the Detroit field office, and Paulie Ferrante and his brother's case, the organizational restructuring that would be necessary now that the Moretti Syndicate's financial architecture had been exposed to federal scrutiny from 2 directions simultaneously. There was the Leadership Council to address. The 7 men who had sat in that room and watched Edward's 30 years collapse in real time, and who would need to understand what the organization was now, what it was going to be, what Vincent was going to ask of them going forward. There was all of that. And it was real, and it was large, and it was going to require everything he had for a long time. But right now there was only the table and the 2 empty cups and Charlotte's ring on her finger and the specific quality of silence that exists between 2 people who have been through something that changed the shape of the thing between them and are sitting in the first quiet moment afterward, not yet deciding what to do with it, just letting it exist. He said, "I should have read the documents." "Yes," she said, "you should have." "I should have been in the room more." "Yes." "I should have asked what you were working on." She looked at him. "You're going to make a list," she said. I know what you're trying to do." Her voice was not unkind, it was just precise. "You're trying to identify all the failures so you can resolve them, so you can have a complete accounting of everything that went wrong and a corresponding commitment to fix each item." She held his eyes. "That's how you run the organization. It's not how you do this." He looked at her. "Then how do you do this?" She thought about it. For a moment she looked like she was going to give him the careful, fully considered answer, the one she would have given if she'd had more sleep and less of the last 24 hours on her. And then she seemed to decide against it, to let the careful version go and give him the real one instead. "You show up," she said. "That's it. You show up when the thing in front of you is harder than the thing on your phone. You choose the room you're actually in." She paused. "I'm not asking you to be a different person. I married the person you are. I'm asking you to be that person in this room instead of somewhere else." He sat with that. It was a small thing, and it wasn't a small thing. It was the kind of statement that sounds simple because it has been boiled down from something very large and complicated into its essential truth, and the simplicity of it is the product of a long and difficult process of reduction. "I can do that," he said. "I know," she said. "Otherwise, I wouldn't have built the trail for you to follow." He almost said something else and then didn't, because there was something in the completeness of what she'd just said, the closure in it, the roundness, that didn't need anything added. She had built the trail because she believed he could follow it. He had followed it. They were here. Dom knocked on the restaurant door at 1:15 and opened it 6 inches and said, through the gap, with the practiced discretion of a man who has spent 9 years knowing when to interrupt and when not to. "Marcia's office called. They're moving faster than expected. She wants both of you in an hour." "Tell her 90 minutes, Charlotte said without looking at the door. Dom looked at Vincent. Vincent nodded once. 90 minutes, Dom said to whoever was on the phone. He closed the door. Charlotte stood up. She picked up her bag and settled the strap on her shoulder and looked at the table for a moment. The empty cups, the cleared surface. She looked at it the way you look at the evidence of a conversation you'll carry for a long time, cataloging it without meaning to. Then she looked at Vincent. "I need coffee before I walk into a federal office," she said. "There's a place 2 blocks east that's open all night," he said. She raised an eyebrow slightly. "You know the all-night coffee places on the north side." "I know things," he said. The almost smile again, more complete this time. Apparently. They walked out of the restaurant together into the night air, which was still damp from the earlier rain but had cleared enough that the lake smell was present. The particular cold mineral smell that was specific to Chicago at night in early autumn. The smell that had been in the air when he'd stood in the dining room with the burned-down candles and the empty plate and the 5 words on a folded note. And that was in the air now, and that would probably always remind him, going forward, of both of those things simultaneously. Dom fell into step behind them at a respectful distance. The others spread out without being directed to. The particular formation that materializes around Vincent when he's on foot in the city. The adjustment of bodies in space that happens through habit and practice rather than instruction. Charlotte walked beside him, not holding his hand yet. That would come later, in some ordinary moment that neither of them would be able to identify in retrospect as the moment it happened, which was probably how it was supposed to happen. But beside him, which was different from the night of their anniversary, when he'd stood in the kitchen doorway and she'd had her back to him and the space between them had been full of things neither of them had said. The space now was different, not empty. It had everything of the last 24 hours in it, and everything of the 22 months before that, and all the documents unread and the rooms he hadn't been in, and the 8 months since she'd left documents on his desk and waited to see if he'd look. All of that was in the space between them, and it wasn't clean and it wasn't resolved in any final way. These things don't resolve in final ways. They become part of the ongoing material you're working with, the sediment of a shared life that you're either building with or being buried by. But they were walking in the same direction, which was something. At the federal building at 3:40 in the morning, Charlotte walked into Agent Marsh's office and sat down across from her and opened the second notebook and began talking through the technical details of the financial documentation with the precision and stamina of a woman who has been waiting to have this particular conversation for 14 months and is not going to be imprecise about it now that she's finally having it. Vincent sat to her left and listened and contributed when she indicated and watched the federal agent across the table take notes with the efficient gravity of someone who understands they are receiving something important. And he thought about 30 years of Edward Callahan and the Parallel Empire, and Polly Ferrante's brother in a federal case, and the 7 men in the meeting room who would call him tomorrow wanting to understand what the organization was now. He thought about all of it, and he thought about what Charlotte had said. You show up. You choose the room you're actually in. He was in this room. He intended to stay in it. At 6:20 a.m., Marsh's office filed the initial preservation order covering all accounts and entities identified in Charlotte's documentation. At 6:41, the automatic transmission from Charlotte's contingency system was formally paused, canceled in the end, because the evidence had arrived at the right place through the right channels, delivered by the people who had built it, in the way Charlotte had always intended it to arrive. At 7:05, Vincent and Charlotte walked out of the federal building into a morning that was cold and clear, the lake visible at the end of the street 3 blocks east, the light on it pale and hard and very clean. Charlotte stopped on the steps. She tilted her face up slightly. He watched her do it, the particular gesture of someone who has been inside too long and is remembering what outside air is like. He stopped beside her. After a moment, she said, "What do you need to do today?" "Counsel," he said. "Then the legal team. Then figure out what the organization looks like after this. That'll take weeks, probably months." She nodded. She was still looking at the lake. "I'm going to call my sister," she said. "She's been worried, and I need to sleep for approximately 12 hours. She paused. "After that, I'd like to go home." "I'll take you." "I know you will." She looked at him. "I meant the other thing, the going home part. Not just the location." She held his eyes. "I meant the part where it's actually home again." He understood what she meant. It was not a guarantee. She wasn't offering him one, and he wasn't asking for one, because guarantees of that kind belong to people who haven't been through the specific sequence of choices and consequences they'd just been through, and they'd both emerged from it understanding that what they were building was not a structure that could be guaranteed, but one that had to be chosen, repeatedly, in the specific rooms of specific moments, over the long, ordinary distances of a life. "Yeah," he said, "that part too." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she turned and walked down the steps, and he walked beside her, and Dom fell into step at a distance, and the morning opened up around them. Chicago in early October, cold and clear and indifferent and loud with its own ongoing life. And they moved through it together, which was not the same as moving through it without damage, or without history, or without the full weight of what 22 months of quiet determination and one night of wrong choices had cost both of them. But together. And forward. The lake at the end of the street caught the morning light and threw it back without apology.